Welcome back. We're going to turn now to the Middle East, a festering sore that is now, I'm afraid, a product of the Biden administration's policies as they relate specifically to Israel and Iran. And there's such a stark contrast between the state of affairs today and what Joe Biden inherited when he took office. Both with respect, I believe, to Iran and certainly with respect to Israel. To talk about all this, I'm pleased to have our colleague at the Center for Security Policy, a man who directs its Middle East programs, Dr. David Wurmser. He brings a remarkable background of service to our country as a naval intelligence officer in the reserves, as well as a civilian at the State Department, the National Security Council, and in the office of the Vice President of the United States. David Wurmser, it's always good to have you with us. So the tidings are grim at the moment, it seems.
But it's always an honor to be with you, Frank. So.
Thanks. Let's start with Israel and the Palestinians. The Biden administration, it seems, David, is exacerbating tensions between the two that are now increasingly manifesting in violence. A journalist was killed in a crossfire between Palestinians shooting at Israeli soldiers and getting return fire from them. What do we know about this incident, and what does it tell us about the larger state of affairs?
Well, what happened was that if you remember the 19 Israelis that have been killed over the last month and a half, the vast majority of them were killed in terror attacks that originated and populate in the Jenin area of the northern West Bank, northern Samaria. And so the Israeli army has conducted over the last month several incursions into that PA, Palestinian Authority controlled area, to try to clean out some of these cells. The problem is some of them are Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade cells, which are part of Fatah, which is part of Abu Mazen's, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. So the Israelis are not getting great cooperation at all, and in some cases have to fight some of the Palestinian Authority families. So you've had a series of these incursions, and they're focusing in the northern part of Samaria, the area of Jenin and Nablus, which, for those who study the Bible, is the ancient city of Shechem. Mm-hmm. So that's the nature of this. And what happened the last few days.
Tell us about the journalist, and apparently she was an American citizen as well.
In one raid, a few hours, 48 hours ago or so, there was very heavy fighting. No Israeli soldiers were injured, but a journalist from Al Jazeera, a very pro-Palestinian journalist from Al Jazeera, Shireen Abu Akleh, was killed. She was shot in the head. And of course, everybody ran immediately, including Ilhan Omar, the Squad, etc., condemning Israel for, quote, executing this journalist. But the truth is, when one goes through the forensics of it, first of all, there are no forensics that are public. The Palestinian Authority quickly confiscated the body and buried her without anybody being able to do anything about it other than the coroner for the Palestinian Authority, who interestingly said there was no way to determine who had actually killed her. Was it the Palestinians or the Israelis? Which, if you know the Palestinian Authority, that's code for saying the Israelis did not kill her, because if he had evidence that the Israelis had, he would have been happy to say it.
I'm surprised that he didn't say it anyway, to be honest with you. That's really remarkable.
Yes, exactly. So he said outright, we don't know. The Israeli military has investigated this. They had no soldiers near the reporter, nor directing fire toward the reporter. The only theory they have is some freak incident where a bullet could have ricocheted twice off walls and then struck her in the head to change direction. Yeah. However, we do know
it's like the Kennedy assassination. That's not terribly likely.
Yeah, I know. Bullet. I mean, this is not a pool game where you double bank,
triple bank shots.
Yeah, exactly.
Needless to say.
The Palestinians, who were shooting indiscriminately, on the other hand, were shooting in that direction, and we have videos of them coming out of the line of direct fire to her, screaming, "We shot a soldier! He's down! He's down! He's down!" We shot a soldier. Now she was wearing military style vest, the helmet, everything, it's more likely than not
Sounds
that
a
the
lot more likely.
Palestinians actually
But
killed.
David, we're going to run out of time before we run
Yeah,
out of things to talk with you about. Talk to me a little bit about what this indicates about the level of violence that is now being perpetrated. Um, I think it's fair to say, principally by Palestinians against Israelis, and how the Biden administration is responding to this increasing problem. Again, I think substantially of their making.
I think that's the bigger story, which is Israel's losing control. It's losing control not only of Jerusalem. We saw these demonstrations of 200,000 people. It's losing control of its security, and it's losing control of its own cities now. There are massive demonstrations today in various Israeli cities of Palestinians marching through the streets, waving Palestinians' flags, calling for the death of Israel. I think this is a larger reflection of, one has to remember under the Trump administration, there was no war, there were no demonstrations, despite everybody saying there would be the Arab street revolting if the Jerusalem was recognized as Israel's capital. It was all quiet. And now, all of a sudden, over the last year, starting literally almost the week that Biden was inaugurated, you see this increasing internal and external threat against Israel. It's open season on Israel, and Arabs in Israel now are beginning to sense that, and they don't face a government. They're facing a left-oriented government, so there's a lot of reasons why the government can't crack down, including the fact that the Arab parties in the government. So they're losing control of the streets, not only of the West Bank or Gaza, but of the street. And you have the Biden administration
Inside Israel itself.
inside Israel itself. And you have the Biden administration deadly silent on the
Mm.
threats Israel's facing, but very loud on championing Palestinian
Yeah.
interests, including now a return to Oslo and a settlement freeze and all that.
Right. And the Palestinians are very adept at interpreting that as support for their position. Beyond that, there's talk that the president is going to go to Israel in the near future and maybe make an excursion into East Jerusalem. Talk about that idea, David, and the circumstances that are being
Mhm.
apparently considered that would greatly intensify that communication to the Palestinians, encouraging such violence and worse.
The two highest goals of this administration thus far have been to undo the Trump administration successes, the Abraham Accords, and
Yes.
the transfer of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And the Abraham Accords, there has been an attempt for over a year now to force by the United States to force the Palestinian issue back to front and center under the idea that the Abraham Accords are fake peace without the Palestinian issue, and return it back to the Oslo framework, which had
Mhm.
failed probably 5,786 times already. So they're trying to take a successful peace and turn it into a failed peace process. And the Israelis have not taken up on that. So sending the president, you had Blinken a month ago, you had lower level officials a year ago. They're just escalating this attempt. The second part is to undo the recognition of Jerusalem,
Mhm.
which is essentially when the president wants to go to Israel, he wants to visit Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem without Israeli accompaniment,
Mhm.
which is, first of all, unheard of, that a nation demands the sovereign country in control of the situation to butt out.
Right.
It's really a very hostile act against what should be an ally. But it
And
really
an
is,
inciting act
yeah.
to Israel's enemies.
But it's an
Needless to say.
attempt to undo the recognition of
Right.
Jerusalem. That
Right.
the
David, there's been talk as another instrument of that of creating a new U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem. Would you expect that if the president does make this pilgrimage into that area, that would be one of the things that he's either announcing or at least putting in motion?
Well, he certainly is going to try to push that issue. I mean, that's the ultimate undoing of the recognition of Jerusalem is to establish essentially a parallel Palestinian embassy there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that will be on his agenda. I'm sure he will undertake symbolic acts to push that issue forward. The Israelis ultimately would have to approve, and they're not going to, from what I
Yeah.
can tell, although the pressure is mounting on the Israelis.
Intensifying, for
And
sure.
it's really becoming very difficult for them to resist what is essentially real hostility now emerging from Washington. You can't
Yeah.
really see Washington as more pro-Israeli at this point than Beijing or Moscow, and that's a very disturbing phenomenon.
Yeah. And it will inevitably, I think, exacerbate enormously not just the pressure on Israel, but the threats to it, both from the Palestinian quarter and of course from Iran. We don't have time to get into the Iran issue, David. We're going to have you back next week to get an update on that. But suffice it to say, what the administration is doing in this regard is of a piece, I think, with what it's doing more generally, which is a wrecking operation. And whether it's under the pretense of undoing the Trump legacy or whether it's simply doing harm to America's vital interests, including its relations with these key allies, it is unspeakable and should be condemned, not endorsed. Thank you for your time, my friend. It's great to always talk with you. Dr. David Wurmser, come back with us updates, if you would, as soon as possible. Next up, we'll be speaking with Gordon Chang about developments in China and the wrecking operation in that regard as well, right after this.